In the midst of the cold glow of a millionaire life, a man discovers that some losses cannot be bought back, not even with all the money in the world. In a silent dawn, an unexpected encounter on the sidewalks transforms luxury into guilt and success into regret. Faced with someone who was once his safe harbor, now reduced to the invisibility of the street, he is forced to face the consequences of his choices. And when the past returns in such a brutal way, only one question remains. Is there still time to repair the irreparable? Before diving into this intense story about love, pride, and redemption, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications to follow more stories that touch deep in the soul. The wind that blew down through Vale do Anhangabau that June dawn did not ask for permission. It cut the skin like a thin blade, pierced the fabric of the most expensive coats, and completely ignored the distinction between those who had a roof and those who did not. It was the kind of cold that São Paulo imposes with absolute indifference, without caring about the size of the bank account or the weight of the last name engraved on the business card. Renato Cavalcante walked slowly along the promenade, near Viaduto do Chá, his hands tucked into the pockets of the cashmere overcoat that had cost the equivalent of the monthly salary of 3 of his employees. He was not there by accident, but he also could not explain exactly what had brought him to that point in the city at almost 2 in the morning. He had left the business dinner at Fasano with a bitter taste in his mouth that was not from the Barolo wine he had served his guests. It was something else, an old, tired dissatisfaction that lately insisted on appearing exactly at the moments when he should feel most proud of himself. The dinner had been a success. The contract with the Dutch group was practically signed, and the expansion of Cavalcante Agro to the European market was a matter of weeks. His advisors were thrilled, his partner toasted 3 times, and the Dutch businesswoman even said she rarely saw someone with such strategic vision. Renato smiled, thanked her, cut the steak with precision, and felt, inside, a void so wide it actually hurt. He was 43 years old. He owned a penthouse in Itaim with a view of the entire city, a farm in the interior of Goiás, an apartment in Lisbon that he rarely visited, and a fleet of cars that included 2 models that were not even for sale to the general public. He also had a schedule that could no longer fit any appointments, 3 assistants who answered for him before he needed to speak, and a loneliness so well-dressed that most people around him didn't even notice it existed. He walked a few more steps and stopped in front of a closed storefront. The reflection that stared back at him was that of a well-built man with grey hair at the temples that magazine photographers called mature charm, an impeccable suit, correct posture. A successful man without a doubt, but there was something in his own eyes that he couldn't name, a question that had no answer in any of the spreadsheets his analysts prepared every week. He turned left almost unintentionally, descending toward the historic center, along a path his drivers would never take. It was not an area he frequented. His world was restricted to the Faria Lima, Berini, Jardins Axis, the São Paulo that works in a suit and earns in dollars. But something that night pulled him out of the known perimeter, as if the city had a specific message for him and needed to deliver it far from the starred restaurants and marble lobbies. It was at the corner of Rua Florencio de Abreu and a nameless alley that he saw it. At first, it seemed like just one more of the figures the city collected in its shadows. A human form huddled against the wall of a closed commercial building, wrapped in cardboard that had been folded with a kind of methodical care. The feet, covered by worn sneakers, were turned toward each other like those of a sleeping child. There was something in that position, a vulnerability so exposed, so defenseless, that made Renato stop completely. He was not used to stopping. His entire life had been built on the principle of constant movement, of action, of quick decision. Stopping was wasting time, and time was the only resource that money could not buy back. But there, on that damp sidewalk that smelled of concrete and night, something larger than habit held him back. He took a step toward the figure. The weak light from the nearby lamppost barely reached that corner, but it was enough to reveal a face partially covered by a worn scarf. A hand emerged from under the cardboard, fingers slightly curled, the palm facing up with the resignation of one who has learned to no longer ask for anything. Renato lowered himself slowly, and it was in this movement that the light found the right angle. His heart stopped. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a physical stop. A whole second in which the muscle in the center of his chest simply forgot what it was doing. Because the face the lamppost illuminated, older, thinner, marked by the weight of things he couldn't even imagine, was a face he knew better than his own. It was the face that had appeared in dreams he pretended not to have had. It was the face of Lara Fonseca. The name returned with a force that had no relation to the time past. 15 years. 15 years since the last time he had seen her, and yet the recognition was immediate, visceral, as if some primitive part of him had never stopped knowing where she was. He stood still for a long moment, unable to move or think clearly. His mind went forward and backward at the same time, to the woman lying there in the cold, and to the woman he had known, the one with dark hair and an easy laugh who had appeared in his life when he had nothing but debt and determination. The woman who had believed in him before any bank, any investor, any partner did. The woman he had left behind when success finally arrived, as if she were part of an outdated phase, an old version of himself that needed to be discarded along with the cheap furniture and the backyard apartment. Guilt arrived slowly, as the guilt of cowards always does. Too late, but with enough weight to buckle the knees. Renato took off his overcoat without thinking. It was an automatic gesture prior to any reasoning. He folded it carefully and covered her shoulders without waking her, without making a sound. Then he stepped back and stood there, on the sidewalk, in the cold that now hit his linen shirt directly, and he did not leave. He didn't know what was there, in that silent decision to stay. It wasn't charity. He had given more to NGOs last year than many hospitals received in decades, and that had never warmed him. It wasn't just guilt, although guilt was present, thick and real. It was something else, something he had buried so deep that it took 15 years and a sidewalk in downtown São Paulo for it to come to the surface. He stayed there until the sky began to brighten, protecting a sleep that was not his to protect, facing the cold as a form of payment for a debt that no money in the world had enough currency to settle. Lara woke up with the instinct of someone who has learned to sleep with one eye open. The movement was fast. Her eyes opened, her body contracted, her hands searched the void around her before consciousness fully returned. It was like this every morning on the streets. The first second was always pure panic, a startle that preceded any organized thought. Then came the silent check. Her belongings were still there, the canvas bag with her documents between her belly and the cardboard, the coat rolled up under her head as a pillow. The coat. Lara raised her eyes and noticed the different weight on her shoulders. It wasn't the worn coat she had folded hours before. It was another, thicker, darker, with a silk lining she recognized by touch even before seeing it. The smell was also different, a discreet and expensive masculine perfume, the kind that department stores display in glass cases with special lighting. She sat up abruptly, her heart racing, her eyes sweeping the sidewalk in all directions. That was when she saw him. He was leaning against the wall of the building a few meters from her, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his arms crossed over his chest, as if trying to retain the heat the coat would have given him. He seemed to have spent the night there. The hair she remembered as totally dark now had white strands at the temples, and his face showed the first signs of a maturity that didn't exist the last time she had looked at him. But it was him. There was not the slightest doubt. Renato Cavalcante. The name crossed Lara's mind like an electric current, and what came with it was not longing. It was something much more complex, a mixture of shock, shame, and an old anger she had kept for years, in a drawer she thought was locked. The drawer opened on its own. She stood up quickly, his coat falling to the ground, and took 2 steps to the side as if she needed physical space to process the absurdity of that scene. Renato opened his eyes at the same instant, and what crossed his face was an expression she didn't expect. It wasn't pity. It wasn't the condescending expression she had learned to detect in people's eyes when they were on the street, that mixture of discomfort and relief that said without words, "Thank God it's not me." It was something else, something she didn't know how to name, and that for that very reason scared her more than anything recognizable would have. "Lara," he said, just that. No. The word came out before she planned it. It wasn't an answer to anything specific, it was a refusal of the whole set, the encounter, the situation, him. She picked up the coat from the ground because it was cold and because refusing the coat would be theatrical, and Lara had learned that theatre was a luxury for those who have an audience. She threw it into his arms with a sharp gesture. "I don't need this. You were in the cold. I know where I am." There was a pause. Renato did not retreat, but he also did not advance. He stood still with the coat in his arms, looking at her with an attention she refused to interpret as care. Care was something that appeared when there was still time. His time had passed 15 years ago. "Did you stay here all night?" she asked before realizing she was asking. "I did." "Why?" He didn't answer immediately. Lara used that second to compose herself. She straightened the canvas backpack on her shoulder, pulled her scarf back into place, and looked at the street with the neutral expression she had cultivated as a shield. The sun had not yet fully arrived, and downtown São Paulo was waking up in pieces. A scavenger's cart turning the corner, the iron shutter of a store being pulled up, the distant noise of a bus that didn't stop there. "Because I couldn't leave," he finally said. She turned her face to face him. There was something in the honesty of that answer she didn't expect, and it irritated her in a way she didn't know how to hide completely. It was easier to deal with Renato when he behaved like the man she had built in her memory over the last few years, arrogant, calculating, completely oblivious to the consequences of his own actions. A Renato who admitted he couldn't leave complicated the whole scheme. "You don't know me anymore," she said. "Whatever you're thinking, you can stop. I recognized you immediately." "That's not what I said." He took a step slowly, without threat. "Lara, I know I have no right to anything, no right at all, but are you hungry?" The question was simple, and it was exactly because it was simple that it struck her where it hurt, because her body responded before her pride could intervene. Her stomach growled almost audibly, in a small and humiliating betrayal. She had eaten a bowl of broth distributed by social services in Praça da Sé the day before. Nothing since then. "A bakery," he said, nodding toward Rua Direita, where the first shops were beginning to raise their doors. Just that, no other intention. Lara stood still for a moment, that lasted longer than it should have. Inside her, the woman who had survived the streets in recent months automatically compiled the risks. Trust granted was vulnerability created, and vulnerability on the streets had a cost she knew well. But Renato was not a stranger. He was the opposite of a stranger. He was the danger she knew by name, by perfume, by errors, catalogued with surgical precision in her memory. And she was hungry. "1 hour," she said. "And I choose where to sit." He nodded without negotiating. That also surprised her. The Girondino bakery was 2 blocks away, on the corner of a street that the morning sun already reached diagonally. They had opened a few minutes ago, and the smell of warm bread escaped through the half-open door with the cheerful arrogance of things that don't know they are being cruel. Lara entered first, chose a table in the back, facing the door, the habit of those who need to see the exit at all times. Renato sat on the other side without commenting on the choice. The waiter came, and he ordered 2 coffees, 2 breads with butter, a glass of orange juice. He didn't ask if she wanted more, didn't make any gesture that could be read as showing off. He just ordered, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to share a bakery table with someone who had slept on the sidewalk. Lara observed all this in silence. When the coffee arrived, she put both hands around the cup and felt the heat rise through her fingers with a gratitude she tried not to show. The first sip was hot and bitter and perfect, and she needed all available restraint not to close her eyes in relief. "How did you find me?" she asked, because she needed a practical question to anchor herself. "I didn't look," he replied, and the way he said it sounded too true to be dismissed. "I left a business dinner and went walking. I don't quite know why." She looked at him for a moment. "That's convenient." It's true. Outside the window, São Paulo continued waking up indifferent and noisy, not caring about either of them. Lara took another sip of coffee and realized, with a discomfort she didn't know how to name, that the anger that had arrived so quickly on the sidewalk was sharing space with something else, something she wasn't ready to examine. Not yet. The silence between them lasted while the bread was hot. It was Lara who broke it first, not because she wanted to, but because the silence carried too much weight, and she had learned that undistributed weight becomes a wound. She placed the coffee cup on the table, looked at the window where the street was already gaining movement, and spoke without looking at him. I was working in an accounting office in Brass. I started as an administrative assistant 3 years after we broke up. It was a good job within the possibilities. The owner was a family man, respected in the neighborhood, paid on time. Renato said nothing. He just listened. And she continued because his silence was not the silence of someone waiting to speak. It was the silence of someone who understands that, at that moment, his function was only to receive. After a while, he started giving me more responsibilities. I was good at what I did. I started managing the payroll, contracts, some larger accounts. 6 years, Renato. 6 years in that place. She paused briefly. When the Federal Revenue opened an investigation into the company, they discovered irregularities I didn't know existed. But the documents had my name. The authorizations had my signature, because he had given me power of attorney to sign on his behalf, which was a normal part of my job. He closed his eyes briefly. She continued. The process took 2 years. In the end, it was proven that I knew nothing. I was acquitted, but the office closed and my name was on everything. No other accounting firm in the region hired me. I tried different areas. I worked as a receptionist, as a telemarketing operator, as a supermarket cashier. Her voice was flat, controlled, like someone telling a story that no longer has the power to make her cry, because the tears were used up long ago. Each job lasted a short time. References were complicated. The gap in the resume raised questions, and when the person searched my name on the internet, the process appeared even with the final result of innocence. People don't read to the end. Lara, let me finish. The tone was not aggressive. It was just firm, the kind of firmness that only comes from someone who has been through things that leave no option. The apartment where I lived was rented. When I went 3 months without being able to pay, I received an eviction notice. I tried 2 municipal shelters. The first was overcrowded. The second I stayed in for 6 weeks until I had a problem with an employee who... It doesn't matter. I left, and I've been on the street for 4 months. Renato sat looking at her for a moment she couldn't measure. There was something in his face she didn't want to see up close. Not out of cruelty, but because seeing meant having to process, and she had protected her own ability to process with such thick layers of emotional distance that any crack was dangerous. I should have, he began. No. This time there was a bit more weight in the word. Don't do that. Don't turn my story into an opportunity to feel guilty out loud. I'm not here to absolve you. He fell quiet. He swallowed what he was about to say and nodded slightly, as if acknowledging she was right. You said you became afraid and started being invisible, he said after a moment, carefully. What does that mean, in practice? The question was unexpected in its specificity. It wasn't, how are you, or what can I do? It was a real question, wanting to understand the real mechanism. Lara looked at him for a second before answering. On the streets, when a woman is recognized as a woman, she becomes a target of men, of groups, of whoever wants to exercise power over someone weaker. I learned quickly that invisibility protects. I cut my hair, wore looser clothes, learned to move without drawing attention, to choose places where no one notices arrival or departure. She paused. It worked most of the time. Most of the time. No strategy works 100%. There was something in the air between them that was no longer just tension. It was a kind of forced honesty, the kind that happens when circumstances strip away the normal social filters and 2 people see each other without the attire they usually wear when they meet. It wasn't comfort. It was more like the moment after a storm passes, and the air has that raw cleanliness that can be beautiful or scary depending on who looks. Are you safe now? He asked. I'm in a public place with you during the day. Yes. That's not what I meant. I know what you meant. She looked at her cup. No. There is no permanent safety when you live as I live. There are better days and worse days. Renato was quiet for a while. She ate the rest of the bread slowly, with the attention of someone who knows they are not sure when the next meal will be. He didn't comment. He just ordered more coffee for both without asking, and she didn't refuse. "I left thinking I was moving forward," he said suddenly, looking at the table. There was no excuse in his tone, just a raw observation. Cavalcante Agro was an idea I had in my head for years. When the first investment appeared, I needed to move fast. I told myself you would be fine, that you were strong, that the world would treat you well because you deserved it. You told yourself that because it was easier than telling me you were leaving. The sentence landed without cruelty, just with the precision of someone who has spent enough time with the facts to know them in all their edges. "Yes," he said, and added nothing. Outside, a delivery truck stopped in front of the bakery. The deliveryman unloaded boxes with fast and mechanical movements, the routine of a job that leaves no room for contemplation. Lara watched him for a moment, thinking of all the versions of mechanical work she had done in recent years, each ending in a way she hadn't predicted, and that had left her one step lower than she was before. "What do you want from me, Renato?" The question was direct and necessary. He raised his eyes. "Nothing you don't want to give." "That's not an answer. It's the only honest one I have right now." He leaned his elbows on the table. "I know I have no right to show up here with a ready-made plan, but I spent all night on that sidewalk thinking, and the only thing that became clear was that I can't ignore what I saw. I can't walk back to my car and pretend this night didn't happen." Lara fell silent. The bakery was fuller now, office workers rushing in, students with heavy backpacks, the normal rhythm of a weekday morning in São Paulo. No one looked at them. No one could know, seeing the woman with short hair and simple clothes and the man in a shirt without a coat at a back table, that more than 15 years of choices, consequences, and a question that neither yet knew how to answer were condensed there. "I have to go," Lara said, picking up her backpack. "I know." He didn't try to stop her. "Can I meet you tomorrow? Same place, same time." She stood up, looking at him for a second that lasted longer than it should have. "I don't know," she said. And she left. It wasn't a refusal, and they both knew it. Renato returned. At 7 in the morning the next day, he was at the Girondino bakery at the back table, with 2 coffees ordered, and the door clearly visible from where he sat. He didn't know if she would come. He had spent the night thinking she probably wouldn't, mentally building the arguments why it would be understandable if she didn't show up, listing everything she had lost and everything he had caused, directly or indirectly, as a way to prepare himself for the absence. Lara entered at 7:11. Without announcing, without a greeting, she simply appeared through the door, saw he was there, walked to the table, and sat down. The waiter brought the second coffee without needing to be called. "You came," he said. "I was hungry," she replied. It was true. It was also armor. He accepted both things. They stayed in silence while the breads arrived. Lara ate with the same concentrated attention as the day before, and Renato observed her without disguise, because disguising seemed unnecessary. She knew he was looking, and he knew she knew. Transparency was, for some reason, the only ground they both could step on without slipping. "Do you still have family in São Paulo?" he asked after a while. The question hung suspended. She took a sip of coffee before answering. "My mother passed away 8 years ago. Cancer." The word came out without drama, just as information. "My father, I didn't know. I have an aunt in Campinas with whom I lost contact before all this started. I don't call her because I don't want her to know where I am." "Why not?" "Because people who love you when you are well usually don't know what to do when you are unwell. And I don't want to be a problem that someone needs to solve out of family obligation." Renato fell quiet. There was something in that echoed far beyond her situation. He recognized the reasoning. He had used versions of it himself over the years to justify why he didn't call, why he didn't visit, why he built distance instead of bridges. "Do you have anyone?" she asked suddenly, without specific intonation, like someone asking the weather forecast. "No. There were some relationships over the years. None that lasted." He paused. I discovered late that I knew much better how to build companies than how to build relationships. That doesn't surprise me. No? You were always like that. Very good at knowing what you wanted and very bad at understanding the cost of what you chose. She didn't say this with anger. It was an evaluation, precise and devoid of dramaturgy. I admired that in you, you know. The clarity. The ability to see an objective and go toward it without hesitating. It took me a while to realize that the objectives never included the people around you. They were always about the next stage, the next step. You tried to tell me that at the time. I tried several times. The corner of her lips sketched something that was almost a smile, but it disappeared before being confirmed. You listened, agreed, and the next week, you were exactly the same. I was young enough to think that would change. Outside, the street continued its Tuesday rhythm. A couple entered the bakery, ordered 2 croissants, and sat near the window, the kind of everyday scene that doesn't know it's being every day. Renato looked at them for a second and returned to Lara. I want to propose something to you, he said, choosing words with a care she would probably notice. Not as charity, not as a rescue, as a practical solution to a situation I, in part, helped create. She crossed her arms slightly. It wasn't a posture of refusal. It was a posture of evaluation. I have an apartment in Paraíso that has been vacant for 6 months. It belonged to a senior employee who was transferred to Brasilia. It's still furnished. He spoke slowly, without haste, without the tone of someone closing a deal. I'm not asking you to accept anything you don't want. I'm saying there is an empty place that could be occupied, and the only cost would be you having a bed and a bathroom while you decide what you want to do next. Lara sat looking at him in silence for a few seconds. Why Paraíso? She asked. The question caught him by surprise. It wasn't what he expected. It's a central neighborhood, well served by transport, close to everything, easy to move around the city. In other words, it's not near anything of yours. He understood what she was saying. No, it's far from my penthouse, my office, my routine. If you want me not to show up, I won't show up. If you want contact, you can get in touch. The apartment would be yours with no conditions. Nothing is without conditions. This is. Lara uncrossed her arms. She placed her hands on the table, flat, like someone preparing for a negotiation they haven't yet decided if they want to enter. And what do you gain from this? Sleeping better. That's not a business answer. I'm not making a business deal. She studied him for a long moment. The bakery remained full, the noise of conversations and cups creating a background noise that worked almost like privacy. They were invisible to each other in the midst of so many visible people. I need to think, she finally said. Take as much time as you need. If I accept, it's not because I trust you. I know. And it doesn't change what happened. I know that too. She stood up, adjusted her backpack, and stood looking at him for a second. Will you be here tomorrow? She asked. I will be. She nodded once, very slightly, and went toward the door. On the threshold, she turned her face to the street and stopped for a second, as if evaluating something only she could see. Then she moved on, and the bakery door closed behind her, with the light sound of a decision not yet made. Renato sat for a while after she left. The coffee went cold. The noise of the bakery continued around him, not caring about either of them. He paid the bill, went out to the street, and for the first time in many years the day's schedule didn't seem like the most important thing he had ahead of him. The next morning she was at the table when he arrived. She said nothing. She didn't need to. There was a different angle in her posture, a way of occupying the chair that wasn't the same as the day before, less contracted, less ready to leave. It wasn't trust. It was something smaller and more honest. It was the willingness to stay for a few more minutes than necessary. Renato sat down. The waiter brought the coffees. The street outside was cloudy, and the grey morning light entered through the bakery window with the discretion of one who knows they are not welcome, but comes anyway. I accept the apartment, Lara said without preamble, looking at the coffee. Not because of you, for me. Because I'm tired of sleeping in the cold and I need a place to think. Understood. And because I still have things to resolve. She raised her eyes to him. The situation with the process, the documents, the professional history, all that is a knot that needs to be untied so I can go back to working with dignity. I know what I need to do. I just need a place to do it. I can help with that too if you want. Maybe. She took a sip of coffee. One thing at a time. It was the first time, in 2 days, that she had spoken about the future. Not about the past, not about what had gone wrong, about what could still be done. Renato noticed this and said nothing, because saying something would be the kind of gesture that turned a moment into performance, and what was happening there was too real to become performance. "When can we go see the apartment?" she asked. "Whenever you want." She finished her coffee. She placed the cup on the table with a quiet firmness that seemed, for the first time, more like resolution than resistance. "Then let's go now." Oh. The apartment in Paraíso was on the 2nd floor with windows overlooking a tree-lined street, the kind of view São Paulo reserves for neighborhoods that haven't yet decided if they want to be modern or old. The morning light entered through the glass with a different quality than what Lara had known on the sidewalks, softer, more domestic, as if the clarity itself knew it was inside something. She stood still at the entrance for a long moment after Renato opened the door. It wasn't a luxury apartment. It was a functional and well-kept space with good quality furniture but without ostentation. A beige linen sofa, a bookshelf with some books, a dining table for 4 that no one had used in months. The kitchen was clean, equipped. The bedroom had a double bed with linen stored in the closet. It was a place that smelled of absence, a house that had been occupied and then emptied of life, but which preserved the structure where life could exist. "The last person who stayed here was named Diana," Renato said, standing near the door as if he wanted to make it clear the space was hers. "She was responsible for the institutional relations area of the company. She went to Brasilia when we opened an office there." "Do you know her well?" "I worked with her for 8 years, a person of great competence." "But you didn't miss the vacant apartment?" He fell quiet for a second. "Honestly, I didn't realize it was vacant until you asked yesterday where it was. Then I remembered." Lara entered slowly, like someone who doesn't want to disturb the geometry of the place before understanding it. She went through the living room, went to the window, looked at the street with its trees and the light movement of a residential neighborhood morning. A woman passed with a dog. A man came out of a bakery with a bag, the ordinary life of people who have a place to sleep. "I can stay here?" she asked in a low voice. "You can." "No deadline." "No deadline." She turned to face him. There was something in her eyes he couldn't classify. It wasn't gratitude, because gratitude has a specific way of occupying people's faces, and what was on Lara's face was more complicated than that. It was something like evaluation and pain sharing the same space, trying to reach an agreement that hadn't yet been achieved. "I need one thing before accepting," she said. "Whatever it is. I need you to explain to me why." Her voice was firm, but something underneath trembled slightly like wood under pressure. "Not the short version, not the version that sounds good. Why you stayed on that sidewalk all night. Why you came back to the bakery. Why this apartment and not a check or a credit card or anything else that would make you feel you solved the problem without needing to be present." The question fell into the empty apartment with the weight of everything it carried. Renato fell quiet for a moment, standing in the middle of the room, and for the first time in many years seemed not to have a ready answer. He was a man used to having answers, for investors, for boards of directors, for the press, for his own doubts. The absence of an immediate answer did something different to his posture. It made it less constructed. "Because when I saw you on that sidewalk," he finally said, "what I felt wasn't pity." He paused. It was the past collecting something I had owed for 15 years, and had found a very convenient way not to pay. "And what did you owe?" "Presence, the most basic thing." He looked at her without looking away. "When I started building the company, you were by my side. Not decoratively. You worked together, helped organize the first contracts, stayed awake late into the night, making spreadsheets on a computer that crashed every half hour. When the first round of investment came, I left you behind as if I had surpassed a phase I no longer needed. You said I deserved something better than the life you could offer. I said that because it was more elegant than the truth. And what was the truth? That I wanted to grow without the emotional weight of a relationship. That you made me human in a way that hindered the version of me I was trying to build. He stopped as if hearing his own words for the first time. I was a coward dressed in ambition. The silence that followed was of a different quality than all previous silences. It wasn't the silence of two strangers in a bakery. It was the silence of two people who knew each other deeply, once, and who were trying to understand what remained of that after everything that had happened in between. Lara looked at the window for a long moment. The woman with the dog had already passed. The man with the bag had disappeared around the corner. The street was quiet. "I'm going to stay here," she said finally. She turned to him. "But I need something more than an apartment." "Tell me." "I need to recover my name." Her voice no longer trembled. It was the voice of someone who had decided something. "The process is closed, and the sentence is in my favor, but the impact continues. There is a right of reply that was never published. There are platforms that still index the process without the final result. I need a lawyer specialized in digital reputation and someone who knows the credit system well enough to help me rebuild my history. I know the right people. I don't want favors, I want access. If the people are competent and I can pay later, I will pay. That can be arranged." She nodded. It was a negotiation, but it wasn't just a negotiation. It was Lara establishing the terms by which she chose to exist in that space, the architecture of an autonomy she refused to give up even while accepting help. "There's one more thing," she said. "Speak. I know you still feel something for me, not because I'm sure what it is. It could be guilt, it could be memory, it could be some distorted version of what was, but I feel it." She faced him with a clarity that was neither challenge nor invitation. "I am not in a condition to know what I feel. I am surviving. That is not a state that allows clean feelings." "I understand. I don't want you to expect anything." "I'm not expecting." "But I also don't want you to disappear," she said, and the sentence seemed to surprise her as much as him. She continued before she could be interrupted. "Not the way you disappeared before. If you're going to be present, but without expectations." Renato looked at her for a long moment. "One thing at a time," he said, using her words back at her. The corner of her mouth moved. This time, what appeared lasted long enough to be recognized. It was the first smile. The weeks that followed were silent on the outside and noisy on the inside. Lara woke up on the first morning in the Paraíso apartment with her body on alert, her eyes snapping open to the white ceiling of a place she still didn't recognize as safe. It took almost 2 minutes for her brain to process the available information, the soft bed, the clean sheet, the sound of birds outside instead of horns and unknown footsteps, and decide there was no threat. She lay there for a time she didn't measure, letting her body learn that new geometry of safety. In the first few days, she almost didn't go out. She took long baths, ate what was in the cupboard Renato had sent to stock, without asking, without announcing, just leaving the fridge full when she arrived, like someone removing an obstacle before it needed to be requested. She slept hours she hadn't slept since before the eviction, the kind of deep sleep the body had been owing, and that it collected with interest. But there was something that sleep and food did not solve. An internal rigidity she carried in her shoulders, her chin, her way of occupying space, always at the edges of rooms, always with an exit in sight, always with her instinct tuned to detect a change in climate. It's what the streets do to a person. They teach the nervous system to function in emergency mode until emergency becomes the default mode, and the absence of threat begins to seem suspicious. Renato appeared at the bakery on Wednesdays, not every day. They had agreed without needing to talk about it. He appeared on Wednesdays at 7 in the morning at the back table. If she went, they would find 2 coffees. If she didn't, he would drink his and go to work. She went for the first 3 Wednesdays. After a while, she also went on a Monday, then on a Friday. She said nothing about it, and neither did he. They began to talk about other things besides the past. She mentioned she had reread some books from the apartment's bookshelf. There was a novel by José Saramago, that she remembered starting in college and never finishing. He said he had never read Saramago, that his years at the company had replaced fiction with market analysis reports, and she spent the rest of that coffee discussing the author's style with a precision and pleasure that revealed an intelligence the sidewalks had guarded but not erased. Renato observed this and didn't comment at the time, but the following week there were 3 other books on the shelf that weren't there before. No note, no mention. She saw them, ran her fingers over the spines, and said nothing. The digital reputation lawyer was named Marcos Trevisan, a partner in a firm on Alameda Campinas who had handled similar cases before. Renato made the introduction by email and paid the fees in advance without Lara asking, with the explicit condition that she could pay him back when and how she wanted, and that he would never mention the subject again. She received the information, was silent for a moment, and said thank you, with a restraint he learned to translate as the greatest thanks she was capable of giving in the state she was in. The first meeting with Trevisan was on an August afternoon. Lara went alone, with the folder she had carefully assembled during the previous week, the complete sentence, the entire digitized process, screenshots of the platforms that still displayed the case without the final result, a list of potential employers who had refused hiring with references to the process. The lawyer listened to her for 40 minutes with genuine attention, then said the case was strong and there were paths. When she left the office on Alameda Campinas, the São Paulo sky was orange with the end of the afternoon, and she stood still on the sidewalk for a moment, not quite knowing what to do with the sensation in her chest. It wasn't joy exactly, it was something prior to joy. It was the perception that there was movement, that the knot could be untied, that the future had returned to exist as a concept. She called Renato. She hadn't planned it, but her hand made the gesture before the thought arrived. "The meeting went well," she said when he answered. "I'm happy." His voice had a warmth she recognized without wanting to recognize. "Trevisan thinks we can force the update of the results on the main platforms within 45 days, and that the right of reply can still be published in 2 outlets where the case was reported. That's very good." "Yes." She was silent for a second. "I wanted to tell you. I don't know why, but I wanted to." "Thank you for calling," he said with simplicity. She hung up without much more ceremony, but there was something different in that gesture, small, almost imperceptible, but real. It was the first time in many years she had wanted to share good news with someone specific, not with someone in general, not with a vague imaginary recipient, with him. She began to notice when this happened more frequently. The internal reflection of things she wanted to tell Renato, an observation about the city, a phrase she had read, the texture of a specific day. She noticed and filed them away, and sometimes even told them at the bakery on Wednesdays, with a naturalness that had arrived without either of them realizing when. But there was something she still carried, that the apartment and the coffees and the lawyer didn't reach. It was a deeper, older knot that resisted the surface whenever she began to lower her guard. It appeared in dreams sometimes, not nightmares exactly, but street dreams, of cold, of being lost in a city that didn't respond. It appeared when she looked in the mirror and needed an extra second to recognize her own face. One afternoon, Renato found her in the living room of the apartment, sitting on the floor with her back against the sofa, her knees hugged, her eyes open and fixed on something that wasn't on the wall. He had stopped by to leave a document from the lawyer. He had the key because she had given him the key, another small removal of distance that had happened without announcement. He entered, saw her, and sat on the floor beside her without asking anything. They stayed like that for a time that didn't need to be measured. She didn't cry, didn't speak, didn't do anything that needed an answer. And he didn't offer verbal comfort, didn't try to solve anything, didn't make the kind of gesture that turns the other's pain into a stage for one's own generosity. He just stayed present, shoulder pressed against her shoulder, the shared silence with an intimacy that took 15 years and much damage to be able to exist again. When she finally spoke, she just said, "Sometimes it still feels like I'm going to wake up out there." "I know," he replied. "You don't know." "No, but I'm here." She nodded once, slowly, like someone accepting what can be accepted. It was enough for that afternoon. The phone call arrived on a Thursday in September, when Lara was at the kitchen table with her computer open, updating her resume for the third time that week, each version more confident than the previous, as if confidence were a muscle that returned with use. The number was from Campinas. She answered without knowing what to expect, and the voice on the other end was of a woman she didn't immediately recognize. The woman said her own name, said she was calling because she had managed to get the number through an indirect channel, that she had tried to find Lara for years, that there was something important that needed to be said. "Who are you?" Lara asked with her usual caution. "I am Claudia Fonseca. I am your aunt." The silence that followed was different from all the silences Lara had kept throughout those months. It was a silence of something opening, not something closing. Claudia spoke for 20 minutes with the urgency of someone who had been silent for too long. She said she had tried to find her niece when she heard about the process, that she had hired a person locating service when previous attempts failed, that she had received a response 3 days prior with a phone number. She had called because she needed to say something that couldn't be said by message. Lara's mother, before departing, had left something in her name. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A small inheritance that had been kept in an account linked to the estate, locked by a procedural issue that took years to resolve. The probate had been closed 2 months earlier. The amount was available. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough for a fresh start without depending on anyone. Lara sat with the phone to her ear, long after the call ended. There were a number of things happening at the same time inside her that would be impossible to name in order. There was the presence of her aunt, this voice from the past that had crossed years of silence to reach her. There was the mention of her mother, which arrived as it always arrived, with that specific mixture of longing and guilt that doesn't get easier with time. And there was something else, smaller but real. The perception that what had begun on that cold sidewalk downtown was not just the start of a recovery, but the start of a much broader revelation about everything that had been waiting for her while she survived. She called Renato. He answered on the second ring. "Is everything okay?" "My aunt called me." A pause. "The one from Campinas?" "Yes." She told him everything, with the precision of someone organizing facts while still processing their own weight. When she finished, there was a silence on his end that she learned to read. It wasn't absence, it was concentrated presence. "How are you?" he asked. "I don't know." She looked out the window at the tree-lined street, with many things at once. "Do you want me to go there?" She hesitated only a second. "Yes." He arrived in 40 minutes. He brought food. He didn't ask. He just brought it. Sachets of soup from an Italian cantina in Paraíso that he had clearly researched on the walk there. They heated it together in the kitchen, sat at the table, and she told him again, slower, with more detail, as if repeating the story was a way of making it real in a different way. He listened to everything. When she finished, he just said, "Your mother kept that for you." The sentence was simple, but there was something in it that reached the deepest knot that the apartment and the coffees and the lawyer hadn't managed to fully undo. The knot of the child who has no network, who learns not to count on anything she didn't build with her own hands, because hands were the only guarantee available. The knot of the woman who slept on sidewalks because the world had failed her in ways she hadn't yet finished cataloguing. Her mother had kept that for her. She didn't cry, but she was silent for a time that he respected completely, and when she looked back at him, there was something different in her eyes. Not the calculated hardness of the early days, not the careful restraint of the following weeks, but something closer to openness. The kind of openness that scares exactly because it cannot be controlled. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Speak." "When I told you I didn't want you to have expectations," she stopped, organizing her words with the care of someone who knows that what is about to be said has no second version. "I said it because it was true at that moment, and it still is in a way, but there is something else that is also true and that I needed time to be able to say." He stayed completely still. "I care about you," she said, "not in the same way I cared before, not with the same eyes, but in a way that exists, and that isn't just gratitude, and that I can't keep ignoring just because it's safer to ignore." The silence that followed was not the silence of the first sidewalks, nor that of the first bakeries. It was the silence of something new, still without a defined name, that needed space to exist before needing a name. Renato placed his hand over hers on the table, not as a gesture of possession or response, as a gesture of recognition. "I hear you. I am here. This exists. I still have a lot to rebuild," she said. "I know. And you do too." He looked at her, and she saw in his face that he understood what she was saying, not just about her, but about him, about the man who had built an empire of marble and wind and was, for the first time in 15 years, sitting in a simple kitchen in Paraíso, eating sachet soup with the woman he had tried to erase from his memory, because erasing her was easier than acknowledging what he had done. "One thing at a time," she said. "One thing at a time," he repeated. And this time, when the corner of his mouth moved, the smile that appeared was not the first nor the smallest. It was the kind of smile that comes when someone decides, consciously and deliberately, that the future still deserves to be built, even with all the crooked bricks the past left behind. Outside, São Paulo continued with its usual noise, indifferent and immense. But in that small kitchen of an apartment in Paraíso, there was something that the whole city couldn't make enough noise to cover. It was the private silence of two people who chose, finally, to be in the same place at the same time. October arrived with the early heat that São Paulo sometimes offers before spring decides it's official. The trees on the Paraíso street were an intense green, and the light entering through the apartment window had lost the grey tone of winter mornings and returned to being golden. Lara noticed this one morning while having coffee alone, before anyone else appeared, before any schedule. It was one of those small observations that are only possible when a person has stopped surviving and has begun, with care, to live again. The digital platforms had updated the results of the process. The name of Lara Fonseca, searched in the main engines, now led to the acquittal sentence before anything else. Trevisan had gotten the 2 rights of reply published, and one of the outlets had made an additional note highlighting the favorable sentence as part of the editorial update. It was exactly what she had asked for in the first meeting, nothing beyond what was true, placed in the spot where the lie had been. The mother's inheritance had been transferred to her account at the beginning of the month. She sat looking at the balance for a long time, feeling a mixture of things that didn't fit into one word alone. Her mother's presence in that number, the longing, the gratitude for a protection that had arrived too late for the worst and early enough for the restart. With a part of the value, she had enrolled in a refresher course in financial management at FGV, a blended learning model starting in November. It was an area she knew well. She had managed complex accounts for 6 years at the office in Brass, and the foundations were there intact, just needing to be formalized with a certificate that would make her history legible to any employer who still hesitated. She called Aunt Claudia 3 times in 3 weeks. The first was a short and tense conversation, both sides measuring each other through the distance of years. The second lasted almost an hour, and there was crying, not tears of helplessness, but the kind that appears when something dammed up finally finds a way out. In the third, Claudia asked a question Lara didn't expect: if she would like to go to Campinas to spend a few days during the end-of-year holidays. Lara said she would think about it. But while she thought, there was something in her chest she recognized as warming. That slow process of when a muscle that has been contracted for a long time finally begins to relax. Lunch with Renato happened on a Friday in October, not at the bakery downtown, but at a neighborhood restaurant near Paraíso that she had discovered on her own and suggested for the first time. It was a small gesture, but it wasn't small. It was her choosing the territory, proposing the meeting, deciding the terms instead of just responding. He arrived on time, with the kind of punctuality she had learned was part of his character. Not the calculating punctuality of the executive who values his own time, but the punctuality of someone who respects the person waiting. They sat down ordered, and there was between them the lightness that only exists when 2 people have stopped performing for the other and have begun to simply be. She told him about the course at FGV, about the conversation with Claudia, about a book she had finished the night before and that had an ending she was still digesting. He told her about a decision he had made at the company. He had delegated the operational presidency to a director who had been ready for the position for at least 2 years and had reserved for himself a strategic role that would give him more time. "Why now?" she asked. "Because I realized I had become the company's obstacle," he said, without self-pity. "I wanted to control everything because by controlling everything I didn't need to trust anyone, and not trusting anyone is a very expensive way to function." She looked at him for a moment. "That sounds like something that took time to arrive." "It did, but certain things only arrive when you stop running fast enough not to find them." The sentence hung in the air between them, and they both knew what it contained without needing to name it. After lunch, they walked through the neighborhood without a specific destination, just the street, the October heat, São Paulo around them with all its complication and involuntary beauty. They stopped in front of a bookstore she noticed on the corner, and she went in because she wanted to, and he went in because she went in, and they spent 40 minutes circulating through the tables and shelves, showing each other covers and titles with comments that became increasingly like a conversation between two people who know each other well. On the way out, she bought 2 books. He bought one, the first of the Saramago collection, at her request, with the condition that she not read over his shoulder. Walking back to the apartment, there was a point where both stopped naturally on the same sidewalk. There was no specific reason, a red light, a dog that crossed in front of them, the rhythm of the afternoon that simply slowed. And it was at that point that Renato said something she didn't expect. "I want to apologize to you in a different way than I apologized before." She looked at him. "I apologized for the guilt," he said, "for what I felt on that sidewalk, for the weight I was carrying. That was honest, but it wasn't enough. I want to apologize for what you lost, not by accident, by decisions I made conscious that there was a cost, and that I chose not to calculate correctly because the cost was yours, not mine." The street continued, cars passed, the traffic light opened and closed without either moving. "I hear you," she finally said. It was the same words he had communicated with his hand on the kitchen table weeks before. She returned them on purpose, and by the way he received them, it was clear he understood. They kept walking. The afternoon was beginning to yield to that pinkish tone São Paulo has when the sun is low and pollution does something involuntarily beautiful with the light. She looked at the sky for a second and thought, without the thought asking permission, that there was something very different about seeing this sky from within a life under construction than there had been seeing it from within a life in collapse. She didn't say it out loud, but there was something in the angle she carried her shoulders that afternoon, a little less contracted, a little less ready to protect what there was no longer a need to protect. That said it anyway, for those who knew how to read. And Renato knew. In front of the Paraíso building, she stopped, turned to him, and said with a naturalness that 3 months earlier would have been impossible, "Next week there's dinner here. I'm cooking. Bring the Saramago and at least 3 opinions about the first chapters." He looked at her with a warmth that was in no hurry. "Deal." She entered the building. On the stairs, she heard his step moving away down the street, and there was something in that sound that wasn't absence. It was simply someone going, knowing there would be a return. It was enough. It was more than enough. 6 months after the night in Vale do Anhangabaú, Lara Fonseca sat at the table of a meeting room on Avenida Brigadeiro Faria Lima and opened her computer with the serenity of someone who knows what they are doing. She had been hired as a senior financial analyst by a medium-sized consultancy specialized in debt restructuring, exactly the area where her 6 years of experience proved most valuable. The selection process had lasted 3 weeks, with 4 stages. In the last one, the partner who interviewed her said he rarely saw candidates with such clarity about their own limits and such honesty about their own history. Lara had presented the process, the sentence, the digital reputation recovery work, and the FGV course as part of her resume, not as something to hide, but as proof that she understood what had happened and had moved to correct what was within her reach. The partner hired her the next day. The Paraíso apartment was still the same, but it had changed. There were books on every surface because she had bought more than the bookshelf could hold and started stacking them at the edges. There was a plant in the window that she had forgotten to water for 2 weeks, and that survived anyway, stubborn as everything that decides not to give up. There was food in the fridge bought by her with money from her own salary, a detail that seemed small and was not small. Renato had changed too, with the slowness that true changes require. He had started therapy in August on his own initiative, without announcing it to anyone but her. He went every week, on Tuesdays at 6 p.m., to an office in Consolação, and returned from there with the face of someone doing the difficult work of examining their own foundations. Once, after leaving a session, he called Lara just to say he had realized something that day that needed time to process, but that he wanted her to know the process was happening. She listened, thanked him, and didn't ask for details, because details were his to keep or share when and how he wanted. The October dinner had happened and been followed by other dinners, other coffees, other walks without a specific destination through the neighborhood. There was an intimacy between them that did not yet have all the names it could come to have, but which was real and daily and built on the only foundation that endures, the honest knowledge of who the other person is, with all their flaws catalogued and accepted, not erased. She had traveled to Campinas in December and spent 4 days with Aunt Claudia. On the third day after dinner, sitting on the porch with the sound of the São Paulo interior cicadas in the background, Claudia took a cardboard box from the back of the closet and said she had kept some of her sister's things she thought Lara should have. Inside the box were photographs. Lara as a child on a beach she didn't remember. Her mother young with a smile Lara had forgotten the exact shape of and rediscovered in that paper with the force of something that was waiting to be remembered. And at the bottom of the box, folded carefully, was a letter her mother had written addressed to her, undated, which began with, "My Lara, if you are reading this, it's because the time has come for you to know that I never stopped believing in you." She read the letter 3 times on that porch, with her aunt by her side and the cicadas in the background, and cried in a way she hadn't cried since before everything. Not the controlled crying of one who survives, but the whole crying of one who finally can. When she returned to São Paulo, there was something different in the way she entered the Paraíso apartment. It was the way of someone who knows that place is theirs, not as a concession or as a temporary favor, but as a choice sustained by their own work and the recovery of something that had been unjustly taken. The first thing she did upon arriving was call Renato. "The trip went well," she said when he answered. "I'm happy." The same sentence from months before, but what was beneath it was different now, denser, more precise, with less distance between what the voice said and what the heart contained. "I want to tell you everything," she said, "but tomorrow. Today I just want to know you're okay." "I'm okay," he said. "Me too," she replied. And the sentence wasn't simple. It was the gathering of everything that had been necessary so that it could be said with truth. A cold night in downtown São Paulo, a cashmere overcoat covering tired shoulders, 2 cups of coffee at a back table, an empty apartment that was gradually filled, a closed process that found the right place to stay, a folded letter in a cardboard box that waited for a reader who was not yet in a condition to receive it. It was the gathering of all that. And in the Paraíso apartment, with the immense and noisy city outside, and the stubborn plant in the window, and the books stacked on all surfaces, Lara Fonseca stood in silence for a moment after hanging up the phone and looked around like someone looking at a place they recognize as their own. Then she went to prepare dinner. End of story. Dear listeners, Lara and Renato's story reminds us that the encounters that change a life rarely arrive announced. Sometimes they arrive on a sidewalk at dawn, in the cold that no one planned to face, in a face that time did not truly erase. If this story touched something inside you, be it the resilience of one who starts over, or the courage of one who admits their own mistakes, then it has fulfilled its purpose. If you've made it this far, you know the value of a good story told with care. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any of our next content. Every week we bring stories like this one, which explore what is most human in the choices we make and the consequences we carry. Leave your comment below telling us what you felt. Many of our upcoming themes are born from what you share. And if you believe someone around you needs to hear a story about starting over, share this video. Sometimes the right story reaches the right person at the right time. We continue here, waiting for you in the next one.